Ganondorf, King of the Gerudo, one of the most evil beings in the entirety of The Legend of Zelda. Throughout the games he is presented as being completely at fault for the destruction and pain Hyrule suffers. However, I think it's a bit more complex than that. Yes, he is of course at fault for all the actions and choices he took. But whose fault is it that he actually ended up this way? Some may say demise and his curse. However, we don't actually know how the curse works. The curse was set hundreds of years before Ocarina of Time. If Demise wanted Hyrule to suffer so badly, why didn't the curse start affecting people straight away? Well, I believe that the curse latches onto a host under very specific circumstances. I believe that if things were just slightly different for Ganondorf, he wouldn't be susceptible to it. I believe that the Ganondorf we see in Ocarina of Time was created by the unfortunate and tragic world he lived in. Join me today as I reveal to you that Hyrule and its royal family were the ones who created the Ganondorf that we see in Ocarina of Time. Nine years had passed since the end of the Hyrulean Civil War. Hyrule and its neighbouring regions were in relative peace. However, the wounds of war could still be felt. The kingdom of Hyrule at this time had become an overwhelming force, having a presence in almost every nook and cranny of the land. The Hylians could freely roam around the entire kingdom as they wished, due to them owning most of it. Castle Town, Hyrule Field, Lon Lon Ranch, Lake Hylia, Kakariko Village and many more locations were under the rule of Hyrule. The Zoras, on the other hand, only owned Zora River, Zora's Domain, and they shared parts of Lake Hylia with the Hylians. The Gorons only had Death Mountain, Kokiris only had the forest, and then finally there were the Gerudo, who lived to the west in the Gerudo region, which was mostly made up of a harsh desert and a dry valley. Throughout the entirety of Ocarina of Time, you rarely see the different races communicate with each other. Gorons never venture down from Death Mountain, and the Zora stay hidden in their domain in Lake Hylia, and the Gerudo do nothing but guard their home. The only time in the entire game where we see these races leave their home and communicate with one another is at the end of the game, in the credits. It's extremely clear that there is some kind of restriction holding the races back from leaving their homes, and I believe the ones causing this are the royal family themselves. In Ocarina of Time, it is impossible for Link to travel up Death Mountain, as a guard is blocking the path up. Behind the guard is a locked gate. The only way for Link to access the path behind is by receiving Princess Zelda's letter and showing it to him. This letter is the only reason why Link is allowed to be let through. Since the letter is from Zelda herself, and the guard is a Hylian guard, it can be assumed that the royal family of Hyrule are the ones that control the movement between Death Mountain and Kakariko, not the Gorons who actually live in Death Mountain. The Zoras have a similar situation. Their domain is blocked off first by large boulders, and also a waterfall. Now, it is possible to access the domain behind the waterfall by playing Zelda's Lullaby. However, there was one issue with this. The only people who have access to this song are the royal family and those close to them. The average Zora shouldn't be able to use the song, so it would be impossible for them to leave and re-enter. Now, in Breath of the Wild we know that they can swim up waterfalls, however we never actually see them do it in Ocarina of Time. We also know that Breath of the Wild is set tens of thousands of years after Ocarina of Time, so it might be a thing they've evolved to be able to do. So it's very likely that they cannot themselves swim up the waterfall and access the cave behind. Within Zora's Domain there's a second exit. This one is a deep underwater tunnel that directly leads to Lake Hylia. Lake Hylia seems to be a location shared between the Hylians and Zoras. However, it seems that the Hylians have more power here. Just like Death Mountain, there are gates that disable the ability to travel between the two regions. The Zoras are stuck in Lake Hylia, while the Hylians are free to leave as the gates can be jumped over by horses. In Majora's Mask we know that Zoras cannot ride atop horses, as Zora Link is unable to do so himself. Yet again, it appears that Hyrule controls how different races can move between areas. The Gerudo are also a race that have restricted movement thanks to a gate. At first, this gate may seem like it's placed by the Gerudo themselves, so that men are unable to enter the valley. However, that doesn't explain why, when Ganondorf usurps the throne of Hyrule, the gate suddenly disappears. If the Gerudo were the ones who wanted the gate to be placed there in the first place, why is it suddenly taken away from them when their king becomes the ruler of Hyrule? Well, it's obvious that they didn't place it there themselves, but rather the royal family. Just like the other races, movement is completely limited. Although these races are heavily restricted in where they can travel, most of them still appear to be quite content with the places that they live. The Zoras and Gorons are in their ideal locations, places where they can easily access the things that their races need in life. However, unfortunately, the same cannot be said for the Gerudo. My country lay within a vast desert. When the sun rose into the sky, a burning wind punished my lands, searing the world, and when the moon climbed into the dark of night, a frigid gale pierced our homes. No matter when it came, the wind carried the same thing: death. But the winds that blew across the green fields of Hyrule brought something other than suffering and ruin. I coveted that wind, I suppose. That was Ganondorf's speech in the Wind Waker. It reveals to us some of the horrific conditions the Gerudo were subjected to. However, in reality, it was likely much, much worse for them. The Gerudo likely struggled to obtain basic resources that are useful or sometimes essential to survive. Let's cover the Gerudo's significant lack of wood. As described in Ganondorf's speech, the nights were cold. It can be assumed that for the Gerudo, the best way for them to warm up was by setting fires obviously, and the only way to set a fire was with wood. The only issue is that wood wouldn't have been easily accessible for them in any way, shape or form. Firstly, in the entirety of the Gerudo Valley and Desert, there are hardly any trees, only a few lone ones near the Spirit Temple, so the only way for them to even access a wood is by heading out into Hyrule. However, due to the likely restricted access to the kingdom they had, it was likely that they could rarely leave to collect it, possibly leaving them for days in the cold of night, sleeping on the cold and hard floors of the fortress. Now I know in Ocarina of Time, when traversing the fortress, there are wooden torches everywhere, there's a cauldron with a fire, and there's even an entire archery training field, filled with large targets made out of wood. However, it should be remembered that this section of the Gerudo region is only accessible when Link is an adult, during the rule of Ganondorf, so it can be assumed that the Gerudo would be able to gather these materials themselves at this point. However, before this point, during the time when Link was a child, and Hyrule was ruled by the royal family, it was probably a valuable and very rare material for them to obtain. The Gerudo have suffered so much, yet it seems for some reason Hyrule, the so-called righteous good guys, have done nothing to help them. Now you may say that Hyrule doesn't owe the Gerudo anything. However, that shouldn't really matter. It's clear that after the Civil War, all the races of Hyrule became allies. We see for ourselves Ganondorf pledging his loyalty to the king in Ocarina of Time, yet it can be assumed that the royal family still ignores the Gerudo's struggle. But why is this the case? Well, unfortunately, I believe it has something to do with greed. The connection between Hyrule and greed isn't a new one. The Shadow Temple's famous quote reads, "Here is gathered Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred." As previously explored in this episode, Hyrule's greed has allowed them to hold and keep large areas of land for themselves, subjecting other races to smaller areas, all so they can keep control. I also believe that this greed is holding them back from helping the Gerudo. Hyrule is clearly biased towards the Zora and Gorons over the Gerudo. This favouritism towards these two races could be because of a multitude of reasons. However, the most likely reason that they might have to prefer these two races is that the Gorons and Zoras probably offer better trades with Hyrule. The Gerudo live beside a harsh desert in a barren area. It is probable that they do not have a lot of resources or materials to trade with Hyrule compared to the other races. The Gorons live high up in Death Mountain. In their mines they would most definitely come across a variety of ores and minerals they could use in trades with the Hylians. Not only that, but their home Death Mountain is absolutely overgrown with the plant known as the bomb flower, a plant that is highly explosive and very likely used in the creation of bombs. The Zora likely offer aquatic creatures in their trades, as it would be extremely easy to obtain for them. They would also probably offer ingredients for medicinal items. We see this in the Big Oran Sword side quest, as you have to give the lake professor an ingredient to make eye drops. This ingredient is given by the King of the Zoras himself. Hyrule would see a lot of value in keeping the Zoras and Gorons friendly and safe, as it would provide favourable trades for them. Unfortunately, the Gerudo won't be able to offer much due to the fact they have a lack of items to trade and are trapped in a barren territory. So, where do all of these issues lead to? Well, we know that the Gerudo are a struggling people. They live in a barren region that is under a harsh, scorching sun in the day and is battered by a cold, stinging wind at night. Warmth in the dead of night is hard to create. It's hard to leave their home due to the limited movement between the Gerudo region and Hyrule. Hyrule has essentially abandoned them because they are unable to offer good trades. These harsh and unfair circumstances may have led to a breaking point. A king, fed up by the treatment of his people, wants justice. This man builds up so much hate for Hyrule that he becomes the perfect host of the miser's hatred. He creates a plan in order to usurp the throne of Hyrule and become its ruler in order to help his people and lead them to a better life. However, he becomes greedy and desires even more power. The king of the Gerudo, Ganondorf, becomes the Demon King, Ganon. Time and time again he is resurrected and defeated in a cycle with no end. Every time he rises, he brings pain and destruction to Hyrule, losing his humanity with every rebirth. If it wasn't for Hyrule's bloody history of greed and hatred, the history of Hyrule may have played out very differently, with Ganondorf perhaps being an honourable man.